Hello and welcome to Fraud Talk, the ACFE's monthly podcast. I'm John Duffley, the communications manager here at the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners. Today I'm joined by Tyler Hatcher. Tyler is with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, and he's currently the acting special agent in charge of the Los Angeles branch. Tyler, you've a busy time of year for you guys, so I appreciate you sitting down and joining us today.
Yeah, good morning, John. Happy to be here.
Thanks. Yeah, appreciate it. Tyler, so we chat a little bit. Well, we'll go back and forth and have a good conversation about, the division, what you guys work on, especially this time of year, tax season, something that obviously is, I imagine the busy season for you guys, but as a bit of a background for our listeners, do you want to talk a bit about your experience? I know you've been with the Criminal Investigation Division for quite some time, for at least 2 decades. So I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about your experience and what you do in your current role.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, John. My current role, we call it SAC, Special Agent in Charge. So I've been a SAC of 3 offices now, including Miami, St. Louis, and now our Los Angeles field office, which basically gives me purview over our day-to-day investigations, covering basically half of California. So really from San Luis Obispo, all the way down to the U.S.-Mexico border. So as you can imagine, we've got more than 20 million people, which is almost on par with the amount of time I've been doing this with IRS criminal investigation. I actually just celebrate my 21-year anniversary this week. So I've been all around the world with this job. I've seen every crime that we investigate. I've worked with some truly amazing people. We got the moniker that we're the finest financial investigators in the world. And as we talk about some of our cases, you'll see why that's something we live up to.
Well, congratulations on 21 years. And my first question there is a bit of your time in the division, I'm sure over the last 2 decades has been, a lot of different things, a lot of different instances, changes in what you guys do potentially. So I wonder if we could just start there, kind of talk about, the criminal investigation growth over that time since you began. And then kind of how that's changed through your experience and some of the things that maybe at the beginning you guys were, maybe focused on, maybe those processes changed down the line, but kind of how you've seen the growth of the division over time.
Yeah, it's actually funny. When I started, we were at a not an all-time high, but we were just kind of coming off of an all-time high in terms of our personnel, and that's both our professional staff, our admin staff, and of course our special agent workforce. And it's been really a downward slide since that point in time. We've shrunk to our smallest point in the history of our 100-year existence as a federal law enforcement agency. And just now, with the passage of the IRA, we've gotten some additional money and some additional hiring that we're hoping to get our numbers back up. So right now is really an unprecedented time for IRS and IRS criminal investigation to be able to kind of grow our ranks and really address many of the things that we continue to see through our tax crimes. And of course, we're the only agency that can do federal tax violations. And so that puts our purview kind of at a pretty wide spectrum. We've got the ability to kind of be the experts at everything to do with money, as we can kind of think that through when we think about tax crimes and the responsibility to pay taxes. That covers every facet of life, every professional organization, every professional job out there, and everything in between. And so we have to learn how to kind of be experts in a lot of different industries. And of course, as we've gone through many changes and tried to keep ahead of what plagues us as a society and us as an agency, financial crimes are always kind of similar but very different at the same time. The similarities are they're always greed driven. They're always they always leave a record. We can always see where money came from, where it's going, obviously as it goes internationally and through some of the new crypto currencies. That makes our job a little bit more difficult, but certainly not impossible. But the ways that criminals adapt to what we're doing and the scams that we see always evolve, but they always come back to kind of the same kind of overall broad topics or scams, as we like to put them in context.
Yeah, it's amazing. I've been in this industry just a short time relative to yourself, but the adaptation and the how much this grows, but it really all comes back to your point, those like central themes of greed that just run rampant over all kind of industries. So I'm curious, as we kind of talk a little bit about the criminal investigation division, if you had to elevator pitch kind of how the process works and what your division does, How could you distill that down? Obviously, the complexities of it we can get into. But if someone were to ask, what does criminal investigation mean? Could you talk a little bit about what the division does and distill it down in just like an elevator pitch?
Yeah, absolutely. So, like I said, IRS Criminal Investigation is the only federal law enforcement agency that's authorized to investigate what we call Title 26 or tax crimes. And of course, by virtue of being good at investigating tax crimes, it makes us good at all financial crimes. And as we kind of look at that, we've got a lot of different what we call program areas. Of course, tax crimes number one, non-tax crimes. So we look at the money laundering and currency violations that we find in Bank Secrecy Act, and of course Title 31 there. That kind of vaults us into the international realm, gives us our narcotics mission. Of course, we're looking at the high level organized crime and cartels as they, try to get their dirty money really into, through, or out of the United States. That's where we come in. That's put us in the cyber realm. As of really the last 5 to 10 years, we've kind of taken a lead on a lot of the most complex and highest value cyber crimes out there. Of course, by virtue of looking at our mission on the financial side of things and narcotics and into the money laundering, that gets us into some of the national security and terror finance issues that we see out there. We've got a lot of robust participation in the national JTTF, or the Joint Terrorism Task Forces out there, and all of that kind of culminates with what we do at home to kind of protect revenue and protect really all taxpayers. Every one of us, myself included, are open to scams, and the two scams out there that we always see, and not really two scams, but the two ways is criminals want to either get your information or get your money, and every scam that we touches on one of those things.
One of the things that, as I was doing a bit of research for this podcast and looking through again, 'cause a bit of that process you mentioned, national, international, it all kind of comes back home for all of us. But it's interesting the amount of diligence I think that the division goes into as I was looking through it. And so I'm curious, kind of at the start of that process, through the fact finding, whether it is an auditor, whether it's an analyst, in your group, that early preliminary analysis and the evaluation phase of these red flags. What are some of the challenges that arise? And obviously, like you mentioned, there's a wide range of different, cases you guys may be initially, brought up to speed on it and maybe considering, pursuing a criminal investigation into. But what are some of the challenges in that preliminary analysis phase, when you guys first start to receive the information, first start to look at it and decide if there's something of substance here to pursue? What are some of the challenges that kind of escalate it from that initial, rumbling of something going on to really getting to the point of getting the approvals to actually initiate the investigation?
Yeah, no, those are excellent questions, John. And I think if we kind of take a step back and look at the life cycle of an investigation, that'll show us
Sure.
kind of where those highlights barriers are. And every year we push this out in our annual report. And if you look at kind of the ways where we get cases, we of course work with other federal agencies. We work with the U.S. attorney's offices. So those are a big chunk of where we get our cases. Of course, our own development through some data analytics and some of those things is a part of that. BSA reporting, from banks and such, account for a fairly small chunk of those. Of course, the public is absolutely critical to identifying and investigating cases, and then IRS civil and our state and local partners are kind of how we round that out. And so when a case comes in, it can be from any one of those sources. Information comes in, we deem it credible or not credible, and there's various methods that we kind of look at that. And of course, talking to the person that's reporting the activity is at the top of that list. And as we evaluate those allegations, and of course they're allegations at the beginning, my charge to our investigators is that we owe the American public to be as efficient as we can, especially if the allegations are false. If we show up and knock on somebody's door and the allegations are not true, or there's just not any merit to it, we owe that person or that taxpayer a rather expeditious closure to that process. And so that's kind of my charge to my investigators. But going back to your original questions, a case will come in or a lead will come in. We've got some internal things that we'll evaluate. Of course, we can open it up to some databases that we house within IRS-CI, but certainly within IRS. If an allegation comes in on a tax crime and it says, somebody isn't paying taxes, and we look and they sure are, then that's pretty easy to move on. But we obviously want to know, what's their lifestyle, what are the things they're spending money on, what is their financial picture look like? Looking at assets, cars, houses, boats, investments. Crypto comes in, of course, as we look at those things. And based on those merits, essentially, the agents will present those to really me. It comes back to the special agents in charge to determine if pushing that case forward, is there, if the facts are there, and certainly we're looking at, what crime do we think has been committed and the elements of those crimes. If any one of those elements doesn't exist, then a crime doesn't exist. And so it's up to me and my assistant special agents in charge to make sure that as we open investigations, that we at least kind of preliminarily think that we can touch all of those elements. And I think if you look at our statistics when we push those out, we're the only federal law enforcement agency that has a conviction rate that year after year hovers around or above 90%. And so we're fairly good at kind of judging the merits of some of those cases that come through.
With that rate of success being so high, Tyler, I'm curious, is there, do you believe it's a product? I'm sure, there's a few answers to this question, but is that a product of the systems in place? Is that a product of, the education? I know one of the things I've started to hear from different investigators, across fraud is there's that striking that balance between people who have subject matter expertise, who have been in the industry for, 10, 20 years with, younger up and coming investigators who look at fraud differently, who understand some of the current trends. And we going back to, we talked about the adaptation of fraudsters coming up, but it's all going back to the same kinds of schemes. I'm curious why that success rate you think is so high. Like I said, is it a product of the systems in place? Is it a product of kind of the analysts that are, in charge of kind of following some of these leads, or combination of both?
I think it's a myriad of a lot of different factors. I mean, you hit one of them right on the head. A lot of us have been doing this for decades, and we're cops, right? And cops, we learn to kind of trust our gut, and we see these things because we've seen it so many times that we kind of recognize the red flags in a fraud case, and we recognize, the probability of being successful in a prosecution. And of course that can change as we work with the U.S. attorney's offices and try to align our priorities. Some things shift, and we try to make sure that we're all on the same page as we do those things. But I think it also has to do with, our review process. We've got, several stages, both in-house counsel. We obviously, like I said, we work with the U.S. Attorney's Office, but we also work with the Maine Department of Justice Tax Division, which reviews all of our tax cases. And so by the time we get through that process, I like to say all the T's and all the T's are crossed and I's are dotted several times. And by the time that case gets pushed over for prosecution, several attorneys have looked at it. I've looked at it with my management team. The investigators have done their job. They've gone back and forth. They've, touched on all of the elements of the crime and then push that forward. And obviously we've got to boil down some of our schemes, which are very, very complex, in a manner that 12 jurors can understand it. And sometimes that is a bigger barrier than the actual investigation was. As we look at some of these things and I get some of these case recommendations across my desk, the complexities are almost beyond my capabilities. And I've seen this for a long, long time. And so there's a myriad of different ways that we kind of take approaches to that. And we've absolutely, you touched on the other thing. We've got some subject matter experts throughout our agency and both within the government that we can reach out to when we see something that we haven't seen before. We're not quite sure how to figure that part out. And so there's a real true saying out there. It's a whole government approach, and many of our crimes, whether it's a straight tax crime or more into our money laundering or other program areas, that we need the help of the entire government to put these things together. And as we kind of touch into some of our case successes, we can kind of highlight how that comes to fruition.
Yeah, actually, great segue. One of my next questions was going to be that, some of the complexities of these cases that end up rising to the level of investigation, obviously, getting approval with the DOJ and going to prosecution. I'm curious if anything that you'd be comfortable speaking about, but any cases, maybe of national or international note in some of the complexities of those cases, and how, your division was able to really pull together enough evidence to move it forward enough to actually pursue prosecution.
Yeah, we've had a few really high profile cases come out of the Los Angeles field office. The one that I like to talk about seemingly the most. I'm a big soccer fan. And of course, we just wrapped up the World Cup, and And if anybody's an international sports fan, they've heard of the FIFA corruption cases that we've done, and that actually was out of the Los Angeles field office, and that started as a tax case. And if you look at the aspects of what it took to get that across the line, we worked with many of our federal partners. Of course, us and the FBI were kind of out in front on that case, and we've got dozens of individuals at the very highest levels of international soccer that were implicated in that. Many have pled, guilty to those crimes. We've had a couple of trials. We just finished one in New York a couple weeks ago, that all of us, maybe not knowingly knew that we were looking at or watching the results of that. But we just had a conviction from some Fox executives that essentially bribed their way into getting World Cup coverage on Fox networks. We used to watch it on ESPN and some of those things. And so that's a real life result of some of these fraud cases. And of course, that one touched on international bribery and some other things, but the U.S. individuals implicated into those crimes had tax problems. If you get bribed and you steal money or run a Ponzi scheme, you got to pay taxes on those funds. And that's our path into some of these investigations. We also just recently had a rather large bribery case out of New York where we were looking at essentially it's an international finance of one MDB where they stole literally, millions and millions and millions of dollars and paid bribes all throughout the world. And we've been seeing some pretty hefty sentences, between 10 and 20 years when we're talking about those kind of cases. More locally, but some of the folks that are out there may recognize Michael Avenatti. We just had a sentencing on his case, and part of the job that I find most satisfying is keeping those who we trust, whether it's politicians or attorneys or those folks in those industries, in keeping them honest. And the Avenatti case was a perfect case in that one. He settled several cases for clients and ended up stealing their money, and of course didn't pay taxes and some other things on those cases. And that's how we got involved, is to really, these victim cases are ones that hit home for a lot of us, and we were able to kind of get in and find where the money went, and hopefully we're going to be successful in getting money back to victims. And of course, when we look at our tax crimes, we're all victims. Every one of us that pays our honest share of taxes have an interest in our success in that arena.
I love that mindset you said about keeping people accountable, especially, maybe elected officials, maybe people who are in public office, or higher office in general, but keeping them accountable and making sure that, everybody's protected under them. Because obviously, these kinds of things can run rampant. If I can go back a second, you mentioned a lot of these cases, maybe you guys, take on in your division, ultimately start as a tax investigation, but open up to other crimes. I wonder if there's a number or anything that maybe you're aware of, and maybe a percentage of the cases that you guys ultimately pursue that kind of open the doors to other things that are happening behind the scenes, but they all start with, violations of the Internal Revenue Code.
That's actually an excellent question, and I don't know that anybody's posed that before. I mean, it's the way that we track our statistics gets a little complicated in kind of delineate. Did this start into a tax case and expand from there? And I can tell you, as the tax crime investigating agency, all of my agents are aware that we're always looking for that, and whether it starts as a tax case and mushrooms into something larger, or more often than not, the U.S. Attorney's Office will ask us to come in, into an investigation that is looking at something else, whether that be in our narcotics program area or Ponzi schemes or any other kind of investment frauds. And we'll get in there and we're brought in to essentially trace the money, look at money laundering, and then, oh, by the way, there's a ton of tax crimes here. And I think that's probably, just in my experience, is probably a little bit more likely than starting tax and having it go, something bigger than there. Just there's a lot of protections and a lot of laws regulating when we, even as IRS criminal investigation, can look at and use tax information, and we're very cautious of that. And so it's easier for us to look at some potential money laundering cases, and then when we see indicators of tax fraud, we can kind of go that way. When we start tax fraud and open it up to money laundering, it's more of a natural transition, just because when people try to hide their money from the IRS, they're probably breaking other laws in that process.
Yeah, absolutely. Going forward a little bit, so kind of in the, obviously in the next, 5 to 10 years, the emergence of cryptocurrency, blockchain assets, and transactions, I imagine has to change the way that the criminal investigation division operates. I mean, obviously, as this technology emerges, but as more and more people, start to get involved in it, they're starting to report cryptocurrency gains that they sell throughout the year when they file their taxes. As those cases come about, how has the division transitioned a little bit? Because I'm sure it's a little bit of a different process being able to track that, being able to put systems in place, and also educating, not only your analysts, but the taxpayer about how to actually report on these and what it actually means to own digital assets. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about, this particular instance, and how this is kind of beginning to, and be involved in what you guys do.
Absolutely. And digital assets and cryptocurrencies and anything to do with that, has been this emerging trend, and it's constantly evolving. And if we trace that back, it actually started in 2009. So it's been around for a little while, but obviously the emergence as a more stable platform for investments and purchases and that kind of stuff has kind of crept it to the front of the line, if you will. But if we take a step back, really in the last 5 years, the IRS has kind of got out in front of this and treating virtual currency as a property. That's what IRS guidance says, that it's a property, and that fits really what we've seen it used for, other than when you get kind of behind some of the technology in terms of moving funds and securing escrow and some of those things. It kind of takes on a little bit different a different tone. But when we look at it as a property for us, really in the inception of more widespread use of crypto, it was thought to be this way to anonymously pay for and receive funds or goods or however it was being used. And I think if you look at our track record in those types of investigations, I think the one that put us on the map was Silk Road. And Silk Road, for those
Mm.
of our listeners that don't know what that was, it's what we call a darknet marketplace. And if you think of it as Amazon for everything illegal. And you could literally buy anything that was against the law, goods, services, it didn't matter, on that website. And of course, billions of dollars through, at that time, Bitcoin went through that website. And our job was to kind of get in there, figure out where the money was coming from, where it was going to, because even though we've got these illicit actors, essentially operating in the dark corners of the dark net, it is very difficult to identify who that person actually is. But the one thing that will never lie is who's spending the money, right? We're in that, the criminals are in that business, and we're in those investigations to figure out where the money's going, who's spending it, and who's getting the benefit. And so that's where it started for us. And recently, over the last 2 or 3 years, IRS has been kind of at the top of that podium. We look at the two largest crypto seizures in the history of government. The top number one and number two belong to IRS-CI, and of course, number two, by a very small portion, as I joke with my counterparts over in New York, is home to the LA field office, which has put us kind of in line for taking those most complex cases. And as we look at how taxpayers are reporting those and looking at the way that people are holding assets, we'll see that kind of emerge as a bigger position in our tax crimes than we've seen in the past. We haven't seen a ton of them. I think that has to do with some of the instabilities of crypto. Obviously there's people that have gained great fortunes, through holding and buying crypto. But as we see that kind of tail off and really get some stability to it, that'll hopefully open it up to more of our look. What we've seen at NCI, and I call this the criminal efficiency, is the way that people move money. And in the past, I'd say maybe 10 years ago, it took a pretty considerable amount of time for criminals to get in the tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars in fraud proceeds. And now it's virtually overnight. Through all the schemes we see, the way that we can move money internationally through crypto has really made it a lot easier for criminals to take away substantial amounts of money from victims or government entities or whatever it may be.
It's amazing how quickly this kind of technology ramps up. And then on top of that, the subject matter, again, to your point, it's only been 10, 15 years. This has really been mainstream, and people are really starting to get involved in it just in the last few years. Obviously, people with lockdown during COVID-19, I think a lot of digital assets and things moved to the forefront a little bit. Have you noticed that change though with taxpayers and kind of some of the things that you guys are working on? of that subject matter expertise, just in layman's terms for a regular taxpayer who may have these assets? Do you notice them having the right information in order to, not only protect their assets, but to be able to report on them correctly? Or has it been a bit of an uphill battle for you guys, obviously working on different cases, whether it be a business or an individual taxpayer, just so that they're aware of what they're actually getting into?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. And I think if we look at, the really, I think it's probably been over the last 3 or 4 years. I can't remember when we first saw the digital asset or virtual currency question on like a 1040, for instance. And it's more of an education timeline. And I think for us in criminal investigation, we only see the polar opposites of that. We see people completely in compliance and there's no issues, or we see people that are just trying to skirt every system that they can find, taxes including. And so I think as IRS kind of figures out what that trend is, we've seen some changes to that question. We've seen that evolve a little bit, and we're trying to just wrap our heads around it. I look at it as if you sell a house, those are some things that you have to report on your income tax returns. And I think if we continue to treat virtual currency as property, it's going to be very treated very similarly. If you buy enough virtual currency and you expect gains or losses, then those gains and losses have to be appropriately reported on an income tax return. So in an answer to your question, we haven't seen it yet just because it hasn't been around long enough. I think usually for us within CI, we have to see several tax filing periods, so years, before we start to see some maybe evolution of criminals figuring out, oh, okay, well, if I do this or I change this or put this amount down, then it'll actually work. We've got some pretty robust preventative, computer systems on the IRS side, where if something looks completely out of whack, it'll stop that return from either being filed or stop a refund from going out. And so we always wait to see if the criminals are smart enough to figure out their way around those kind of safeguards before CI gets involved.
I see. Yeah, and it'll certainly be one of those things, as you mentioned earlier. The adaptation is going to follow, and the opportunity for your office to see that in real time and be able to transition. I think it'll be interesting to see how quickly it evolves. And obviously the emergence of technology feels like it's been so fast, but I'd imagine fraudsters are going to be able to do that 2x once they start to situate themselves and figure out ways around what's in place. But obviously, you guys being able to adapt even faster, I think is going to be what's most intriguing to watch. Going forward a little bit, Tyler. So this year, so obviously coming up on tax day 2023 in April, I think one of the things, myself kind of in my early 30s, it took me a little bit to kind of figure out what makes a good tax preparer, be able to look at signs of what to look for, qualities, credentials, etc. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, how to choose a good tax preparer. I know that's kind of a very general question, but whether it's for an individual, an independent contractor, a small business owner, whatever it happens to be, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, what makes choosing a good tax preparer, what to look for, and then on the flip side of that, some of those more common red flags of someone who maybe has fraud on the mindset, a fraudulent preparer who may be looking to take advantage of somebody.
Yeah, absolutely. And we are ramping up, of course, the tax deadlines in about 3 weeks from now. And as we kind of do our public service announcements and reach out, and you should see this from pretty much every special agent in charge across the country, but picking that return preparer is absolutely invaluable for all of us. IRS-CI included. I mean, we deal with this stuff every day, but you just kind of want to put your common sense thinking on. And I know many of our younger crowd and some of our newer young people entering the workforce and having to file taxes on their own for the first time. This will make a little bit of a transition for them. But as you kind of meet with a return preparer, the number one thing that I tell everybody is remember they work for you. So if they ask you for something or they're making demands or directing you to do something and it just feels like it shouldn't be that way, then find somebody else. But some of those common red flags that we see is if they want you to sign anything that's blank, don't. Right? You are, as a taxpayer, we are responsible for the numbers that go on that tax return. Whether you understand how they got there or not, you're still responsible for them. And it's okay to ask a lot of questions, especially if you're new in this process. So signing anything blank, that's a no-go. We always want to be very, very careful of the return preparers that always tout, I can get you more money than everybody else. Taxes are they're a law, and it's not like if we go to somebody else we're going to get a different amount. If we are filing accurate tax returns, the refund amount, if you're owed a refund, or the amount that you pay should be consistent. If you go to 5 different people, you should be getting 5 of the same numbers. And so always be cautious of those folks that are claiming that they can get you more than everybody else. And that kind of parlays into my second point is if their payment or their fee is a portion of what your refund is, then that should be an automatic red flag. Now, it's absolutely appropriate for tax return preparers to charge sliding fees based on complexity or number of forms. That is absolutely normal, and we expect that. But when they're saying, oh, well, I'm going to take 10 or 15 or 20% of your refund, then that should be an automatic red flag. And another one that's a little bit tricky is be wary of those folks that want to take possession of your refund. Kind of going back to my original kind of two things that we see criminals do. They want to remove you from your information or your money. And so that one's kind of one that's a little cautious. Now, I know that these advanced loans and some of those things kind of get into that realm. So be careful, make sure you ask a lot of questions and you read the fine print. But if you have a return preparer that wants to take the entirety of your refund and then they'll pay you out, out of their accounts later, that should also be a red flag. So again, going back and demanding that you can do, look at certain things, ask those questions, meet with your return preparer, face to face if you can. And that absolutely means you can, meet with them over Zoom or whatever other video format that you can do. But always kind of be on the lookout of what that looks like, and making sure that we all file accurate returns. And that's also a good kind of parlay into some of the other things that we've seen. Every year IRS pushes out what we call our dirty dozen. It's kind of the dirty dozen tax schemes or schemes to look for kind of around this time. And I want to highlight one because I've seen a lot as we are on social media and kind of going through different media platforms. I've seen the employee retention credit issue come up time and time and time again. And that credit, it is a legitimate credit, but there are a lot of things that you have to do to qualify for it. And I've seen a couple that basically said, hey, if you worked through the pandemic, you could get this. That's not entirely accurate. There's a lot of other hoops you got to jump through. So if you have somebody that's out there pitching to you, hey, we've got these different claims and different credits that you may qualify for, and they're like that's their only job is to find people for these credits, that should be a red flag as well. If you have a good return preparer, they're going to know which credits that are available to you that you're lawfully able to partake in. And so kind of be wary of those things. Anytime you see somebody claiming that they're going to get you money from the government that you wouldn't normally be entitled to, that should probably be a red flag as well.
Really appreciate those. I feel like a lot of these things, again, when you kind of put them down on paper and you read them, feel like common sense, but tax season can be daunting for people, not just younger people, but in my experience, older people. I've got parents and grandparents who have been doing their taxes for 15, 20 years and still don't really understand that there's those little nuances of it. So really, appreciate you kind of outlining some of that stuff. Going from those small scale instances, of filing taxes on some of the broader things. I'm curious with some of the broader, more large scale programs that you guys have been involved with recently. So I think one of the more prominent ones, obviously, is the CARES Act that was released. Being able to help states, appropriate funds to be able to help with some of those necessary expenditures, et cetera, tied to public health that obviously came from the pandemic. So as some of those those funds started to get allocated and some of those fraudulent opportunities, I imagine had to emerge from that. I'm curious how the Criminal Investigation Division handled that. And then also kind of secondary to that as a early follow-up, but how is the volume of those cases? Was it higher or lower than what was anticipated? Because I'm sure when you hear $150 billion are going to be appropriated for states and territories, tribal governments, et cetera, is going to go out, the opportunity for fraud, I'm sure had to be there at the forefront of it. But as the Criminal Investigation Division maybe started to field some of those inquiries, was it at a higher or a bit of a lower volume than maybe what you thought initially?
It's one of those emerging trends that seems to be cyclical. I think back in, the late 2000s, early 2000s, we saw identity theft was a really big problem. And that's something that we had to kind of cycle through as IRS criminal investigation and look into that. And the CARES Act and everything that touches on that can be PPP, employment tax, credits, EIDL, all of the unemployment things that we saw come with that was just another one of those trends where anytime you have the government trying to push out a program that has, some financial assistance associated to it, you're going to have fraud. And so I think when we saw that, obviously at the beginning of the pandemic, when the CARES Act came out, I was actually in Miami at the time, and South Florida seemed to have, that's almost all we were working. It was a crazy amount. So it was definitely more than I think we were ready for. But we've done a really good job of adapting quickly and looking at those cases. And the nice thing about those cases is they're not super complex. What we were kind of saying at the beginning, in order to qualify, and I'll just point out PPP, or the Payment Protection Program, or Protection Program, is that you had to essentially have a business and have employees and have some other things that you had to show that you were qualified for those funds. And as we looked into them, these are businesses that had existed for the sole purpose of committing fraud. So they weren't open for very long. Of course, no employees. So they were fairly easy to see. And as we've kind of had a couple of years since the passage of the CARES Act, the complexities have increased a little bit, because people or criminals were able to kind of know that that's what we were looking at. So they were setting up some of these shell corporations or shell entities, and letting them sit there for a little bit longer. But you can't invent employees, and so that's kind of the part of this that's fairly easy for us to target and to notice. And speaking of volume, and we just pushed this out in a release, I think yesterday, that we've looked at 975 both tax and money laundering investigations as it applies to our CARES Act initiatives, and that's resulted in alleged loss of $3.2 billion, which is a crazy amount of money. And we're seeing very similar trends that we saw with our identity theft mission, like I said, about a decade ago, in that the initial onset of these crimes were done by fairly sophisticated business owners, or wannabe business owners that kind of knew the process, and then it kind of devolved from there to see we've got gang members doing it now. We've got some less sophisticated folks that are kind of trying their luck at this crime, and we're catching a lot of these kind of bigger fraud, and we're getting some really good sentences, which should tell the public, anytime you steal money that was intended for people that legitimately need it. I mean, we're talking about businesses that are in our local communities that can't stay afloat otherwise, and when you divert that money, you're hurting your own communities. And we want to be aggressive with those investigations, and teaming up with our federal partners, and certainly the U.S. Attorney's offices, in pushing really hefty sentences. And we've seen that it's been 5 to 10 to 20 years on some of these things. And the amount of money that we're seeing some of the more sophisticated folks bring in is in the millions and millions of dollars, where they're recruiting people. Again, going back to my advice on picking a return preparer, if you're getting recruited to file an application for a loan that you number one don't need, and then secondarily are not entitled to, you're committing a federal crime. And IRS criminal investigation treats that very, very seriously, and we're investigating those as aggressively as we can.
Yeah, I think this is great. I wouldn't necessarily call it precedent, maybe not be the right word, but it being how unprecedented this this kind of rollout was, and this money being, to your point, necessary for small businesses, necessary for communities, kind of laying that track down of even if even outside of these instances, if you are going to take money, if you are going to try to file false PPP loans and false applications and things, these sentences are going to be serious, and they're going to be very real. Not just in like I said, everyday instances, but in times like this, where this money needs to come out, because the public needs it. And when you take advantage of it, it's going to be on you to pay the piper, if you will, when that time comes.
Absolutely. And for us, these crimes, they're not hard to find. I mean, I think when we initially sat down and kind of put that whole government approach to it, and working obviously hand in hand with banks and financial institutions that were administering these loans, it was really easy to see that there was fraud kind of from the onset, which is not normal for us. We usually have to do a little bit of digging and, looking at databases and talking to folks and doing a little bit more work. But these PPP loans and some other things, you can tell it's fraudulent from the first time we hear something. So it's pretty easy to pick out, the criminals that are executing these crimes.
And then one of the other things I wanted to make sure we get to, Tyler, as you mentioned earlier, but the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act allocation for the IRS, to your point, maybe 15, 20 years ago, where the departments were a little more robust, then this is really going to provide the IRS the opportunity to hire more services, more folks to enforce the tax code, really over the next decade. I think through 2031, if I'm not mistaken, through that fiscal year, is where all this is going to be able to be rolled out. So I'm curious, in your opinion, kind of how the IRA is going to impact criminal investigation long term, not just in your branch, but kind of across the country.
Yeah, no, that's, like I said in the beginning of our podcast, we talked about how we've just been on a downward slide, and I think the statistics show that within the next 5 years, almost half of our workforce is eligible for retirement. So we've obviously got to start planning ahead for that. And with the IRA money coming in and hiring coming in, I think everybody's heard, the hiring of almost 90,000 employees. And I wish that I could even get a very, very small, even a 1% portion of that for CI. And of course, not all of those employees are coming to CI. Not all of those employees are going to carry guns like we do. But, we within CI are looking at absolutely upping our special agent numbers and our professional staff and investigative assistance personnel to really give a proper amount of service to the taxpayers that we serve. For my division in Los Angeles, we've got under 200 criminal investigators, and we serve a population of almost 28 million. So obviously that number is completely out of whack. But as the IRA money comes in, we're aggressively hiring. And one transition that we've been able to do within IRS-CI is we've now got direct hire authority, which basically means if you've got people that that are listening, that are out there, that have the minimum accounting qualifications, which is 15 credit hours and some related business and other education or experience doing investigations, financial investigations, they can meet one of our recruiters at an event, pass on a resume. That resume gets passed to me. I can look it over, talk to our recruiters on, whether or not they think this person's highly qualified. We can bring them in for an interview relatively quickly and onboard them. And we've essentially cut, 6 to 9 months out of the process that it used to have before. And so we this is the first time within IRS that we've been able to do that, and certainly within IRS criminal investigation. And so we're trying to use that, as much as we can to replenish our ranks. We want to get, back up to an appropriate number, that we can give the service that I think the public expects from us. And I don't know what that number is, but I can tell you we're not anywhere near it. So for the foreseeable future, we will be recruiting full time.
Well, it certainly seems like they're in good hands right now, Tal. I feel like we could keep talking. I could keep picking your brain for quite some time. I really enjoyed this conversation. Again, just kind of in closing here, IRS.gov, I encourage anybody interested in learning more about criminal investigation to head over there. Tyler, again, I appreciate your time today. Anything else you wanted to close with?
No, John. Hey, again, I appreciate the opportunity to chat, and it's always fun to talk about what I've been doing for so long and what great people we have. And I think if you going back on the recruiting, I think if you just do some research and look out there, IRS in general and more so IRS-CI is one of the best places to work in government. And I wouldn't be here for 21 plus years if that wasn't true. So I appreciate your time and look forward to chatting maybe another time.
Likewise, look forward to it, Tyler. I appreciate it again. Thank you for listening to another episode of Fraud Talk. You can find all episodes of Fraud Talk on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. I'm John Duffley, signing off.